Molly's two sisters had been part of my life almost from the moment I started dating her. I'd never encountered identical triplets before, so seeing three stunningly similar faces was both surprising and intriguing when I arrived at Molly's apartment to pick her up. We met at a grocery store when she asked me to reach a high shelf for some herbal tea she couldn't reach. Molly, standing at 5 feet 2 inches, with her curvy figure and short jet black hair, found me a suitable height for assistance. It wasn't until our fourth date that she confessed she had spotted me in the produce aisle, found me cute, and waited near the tea section until I appeared. I must admit, it was quite flattering. Even more so because she shared this revelation while lying naked in my arms after we had made love for the first time. Our initial dates were delightful, dinners that stretched into late-night conversations, strolls in the park feeding ducks, and enduring a cheesy chick flick while holding hands. It might sound cliché, but I was utterly captivated. Molly was, without a doubt, the most beautiful woman I had ever dated, appealing in a wholesome, girl-next-door manner, with a smile that could disarm anyone. After I assisted her at the store, she engaged in friendly conversation, leading me to believe I was the one pursuing her. I was overjoyed when I left with a dinner date for the upcoming Friday. She had mentioned having sisters, but I wasn't prepared for the sight of three stunning Mollys greeting me at the door. When one of them welcomed me as Scott, I was speechless. You're not Molly?" Amused, she chuckled, much like Molly had during our grocery store encounter, and introduced herself as Hannah. She then explained they were triplets and invited me inside. In the living room, I encountered another Molly, who turned out to be Amy. With identical haircuts, figures, and smiles, I couldn't distinguish one from the other until Molly herself emerged and offered me herbal tea. During that first dinner date, we discussed everything under the sun, with much focus on Molly's life as a triplet. I was intrigued and wanted to learn all about their experiences. Did she enjoy constantly seeing herself in two other faces? Were they exceptionally close, akin to twins who could almost read each other's minds? And did they ever swap identities for fun? "I don't know if we exactly read each other's minds," Molly shared, "but we're incredibly close. I often sense what Amy or Hannah is thinking, and they seem to do the same, like answering a question before I even ask it. It's always been that way." As for fooling people, she paused, grinning at me, "We've had our fun with that. You noticed we all wear our hair the same way?" I nodded, encouraging her to continue. "As kids, we loved playing tricks on our teachers, relatives, even our parents. They couldn't tell us apart either, believe it or not. It was quite amusing, especially when Amy or Hannah wanted to avoid getting in trouble. 'No, Dad, I'm not Amy, I'm Molly.' She chuckled. You can imagine how that went. It probably drove Mom and Dad crazy. Then in junior high, we wanted to assert our individuality. We were fed up with constantly being mistaken for each other. So we styled our hair differently, took different classes, pursued different interests. I joined the yearbook staff, Amy wrote for the newspaper, and Hannah played field hockey. But after a while, we missed the interchangeable aspect of being triplets. Occasionally, I'd take a chemistry test for Amy, or Hannah would give a presentation for me. It helped us all out with our grades, you know?" She grinned mischievously. "And there was this one time in our junior year when Brad Hendricks asked Amy out on a date. She was thrilled, but then she fell ill on the morning of their date. She was devastated, fearing he'd never ask her out again if she canceled. So, she persuaded me to stand in for her just for that one night. Since it was their first date and they didn't know each other well, it wasn't too difficult. From the second date onward, Amy resumed being herself, and they dated for almost a year. She never revealed that I had been her substitute. Years later, recalling that story filled me with bitterness. But at that moment, I sat across from a captivating, witty, and charming woman. I was already infatuated with her. The fact that she reciprocated my feelings seemed like a miracle. After college, the three sisters had pursued their separate paths but missed each other, so they all returned to Cincinnati after graduation. They found a spacious apartment to share, which is where I first met Molly's sisters. Fast forward 8 years later, Molly and I had dated, fallen in love, and tied the knot. I considered myself the luckiest man alive. With a job at a graphic design firm and valuable computer skills, we were financially comfortable enough to afford a lovely home in Oakley Square, just a short distance from our downtown workplaces. It's probably no surprise to hear about our neighbors. 3 years after Molly and I tied the knot, Amy married Ted, a tall but rather uninteresting guy in financial services. They lived right next door on Ferdinand Place. Amy's sister, Hannah, lived nearby on Oak Park Place with her husband Arnold, who was quite the character, owner of several bowling alleys, fond of cigars until Hannah convinced him to quit, and always ready with a joke. They had married a few months before Amy and Ted. It was almost expected that our wives would want to live so close together. They were like Siamese triplets, inseparable. Ted, Arnie, and I were accustomed to their synchronized conversations and nightly gatherings in one of our kitchens before heading home to our respective spouses. Even after 8 years with Molly, distinguishing between the triplets wasn't easy, and Ted and Arnie had the same struggle. We relied on subtle cues like clothing or jewelry. Even their parents found it challenging to tell them apart. Although they shared a bond, each sister had her own personality. Amy was more reserved and conservative, while Hannah was the wild one, always up for a laugh. Molly fell somewhere in between, sweet and outgoing but level-headed. While we enjoyed vacations together, I insisted on a week alone with Molly each year. This sparked some initial tension, but after a few years, Molly understood my need for private time together. It took some negotiation, but eventually, we found a balance. I must have given some version of that speech about 10 times. But it wasn't until the day before our Italy trip, when Molly came home from work and saw that I hadn't even begun my packing, that she gave in. Boy, was that an argument. But I said flatly that unless she agreed to a week away with me, I was staying home. She and the other 2 couples could go off to Italy without me. There was more than an hour of yelling, none of it by me, and maybe 20 phone calls to Amy and Hannah. Both sisters came over to help Molly beat me down, but I wasn't yielding. They were happy to explain to me, over and over, how selfish and short-sighted I was being, and how no loving husband would be so inflexible, etc. In the end, Molly agreed to my demand, and off to Italy we went. But it was pretty cold between us for several days, and her sisters joined her in making sure I knew I was in the doghouse. If it hadn't been for the support of Arnie and Ted, who were secretly delighted that I'd won, as it meant they'd get the same deals from their wives, I might have given up and flown home early. But by about the 5th day, the romance and beauty of Florence had softened Molly up, and the rest of the trip was terrific. As was our week alone at Sanibel Island the next winter. After that, each year featured 2 wonderful weeks with Molly's sisters and 1 wonderful week without. So what's the problem? It all sounds pretty terrific, right? And it was. The problem came when we started trying to have kids. Molly and I knew we'd have them someday, but we'd been enjoying life as a couple, or as a couple glued to 2 other couples, too much to be in a hurry. But when she and her sisters turned 30, I was 32, the biological clock started chiming. She stopped taking the pill, and within a couple of months Molly and I were on a baby-making mission. Not that I objected either to the goal or the process of getting there. I had always loved sex with my beautiful, delicious wife. Our sex life was most often intimate and tender rather than rough and wild. We had our usual 3 or 4 favorite positions, and the nights we spent extra time on being playful or inventive grew less and less frequent over the years, as I imagine happens with most married couples. Oral sex was almost always part of our lovemaking, as Molly really enjoyed the way I went down on her. Once in a while Molly would surprise me. She'd come to bed very horny and be much more aggressive, and we'd fuck strenuously a couple of times in an evening. On a birthday or our anniversary we always had champagne, and that invariably got her extra fired up. But for the most part it was more gentle and loving, and that was fine with me. One night after she just ravished me I joked with her about it, and found that it didn't go over well at all. It was a Saturday, and when I got back from the grocery store with the stuff for dinner, I heard her calling me from the bedroom, where I found her lying naked on her tummy on the bed, holding a bottle of massage oil. "I'm a little tense today, cowboy," she murmured. "You think you could help me out here?" It was fantastic. I gave her back and legs a thorough workout, while she moaned contentedly. Then I turned her over and worked on her, first with my fingers and then for much longer with my lips and tongue until she had come 3 times. Then we fucked, hard, until I shot ecstatically into her. We lay together dreamily for a while. Molly went off to the kitchen and brought us back a snack. Dinner seemed to be off the agenda, and before long we were rolling around again. She gave me a world-class blowjob, stopping just before I shot into her mouth, and then she rode me like a wild woman, coming a couple more times before I came again. When we were catching our breath, smiling at each other, I said, "Wow, that was something, Molly." Then I pretended to think hard. Or wait. Maybe you're not Molly. Did I just get very lucky with Amy or Hannah tonight? I'm not sure Molly has ever been that worked up. She couldn't have failed to know I was kidding, but instead of a chuckle or an answering wisecrack, I got a cold stare. Scott, that is not funny. How could you think that I would ever do something like that? Do you really think I would ever share you with my sisters? As she glared angrily at me, I could feel the temperature in the room drop about 10 degrees. Molly, I'm sorry, I said. I was just kidding, honey. I reached to take her in my arms, but she rolled away from me and stood up. I'm going to shower, she said, still clearly angry with me, and disappeared into the bathroom. I heard the lock click behind her. I got the cold shoulder for the rest of the night and most of the next day. Molly seemed determined to send a message that some things were just not to be joked about. Finally, at dinner on Sunday, I apologized again, reiterating that it had just been a harmless joke, and she seemed to relax a bit. She let me spoon up behind her in bed that night, and I sighed to myself in relief. I didn't like having Molly angry at me, and I made a mental note never to joke about sister switching again. It seemed funny, though, her being so sensitive about it. On our very first date, she told me the story about taking Amy's place on a date with a high school boy. And I remembered a time a few weeks before our wedding when the subject had come up again. Molly and I were bickering about something trivial, like which hotel we should choose for our honeymoon in Curacao. Naturally, I relented to her preference. During our playful disagreement, I jokingly suggested that if she didn't want me, maybe I'd marry one of her sisters. Back then, she bantered right back. I doubt they'd take you, darling. Both Amy and Hannah are light sleepers, and I've mentioned your occasional snoring. That would be a deal breaker. Stick with me. Darn. I retorted. All right then, if I can't have Amy or Hannah, I suppose I'll stick with you after all. And that was the end of that. So I couldn't comprehend why, years later, she reacted so furiously when I made essentially the same jest. In any case, as I mentioned, it was our attempt at starting a family that turned my life upside down. We'd been trying, and enjoying ourselves, for about 10 months. Many couples took a year or two to conceive, so I wasn't concerned. But Molly grew increasingly worried about our lack of success and insisted I see our doctor for a checkup. So I did. I endured the awkwardness of sitting in a room with some magazines and providing a sample, then waited for the phone call a few days later. It came on a Friday while I was at work. After closing my office door, I spoke with Dr. Rendell for a couple of minutes. Well, Scott, there's nothing to worry about, he said. Your sperm count is slightly lower than average. It's about 70% of the norm for men in their 30s. But that's nothing significant. Your sperm are healthy and robust, there are just fewer of them. You and Molly should have no trouble conceiving, though it might take a bit longer than for some couples. That was reassuring. I looked forward to getting home and reassuring Molly. But for some reason, it slipped my mind. We got engrossed in a conversation about Cincinnati city politics during dinner, and I forgot to mention it. The topic didn't resurface until nearly 11. The sisters' regular gathering was in our kitchen that night, and I'd watched some basketball on TV before heading to bed. I often fell asleep before Molly came up. As I was nearly dozing off, I remembered the news about my sperm count, feeling the need to tell Molly right away. So I grabbed my robe and headed downstairs, intending to briefly interrupt their conversation in the kitchen to share the good news. Moving through the living room towards the kitchen, I heard their infectious laughter through the closed door. I smiled, pondering how much they relished each other's company, and paused for a moment to listen in on the chat out of curiosity. It was completely innocent, I swear. I just couldn't resist hearing what was amusing them so much, I had no inkling of what I was about to overhear. Voice number 1, well, if he isn't the best, why do you always want to trade with me? Voice number 2, giggling, I never said Arnie wasn't good, I just said he doesn't go down on me like Scott does. Voice number 3, or maybe still number 2. It was hard to discern besides, you greedy thing, you still get Arnie more nights each week than either of us. And weekends too, another voice chimed in. So you shouldn't really be complaining about your situation, came amidst more laughter. I stood there in complete disbelief. To say I couldn't believe what I was hearing would be an understatement, I was beyond shocked. Switching? Having intimate relations with each other's husbands? Quietly, I sat down on a chair, attempting to regain my composure, and tuned back into their conversation. It's been almost a year, and I'm starting to doubt if Scott can do the job. That must have been Molly, I presumed. So, are you moving on to Plan B? Yeah, if his sperm count doesn't come back normal. He got tested about a week ago, so we should hear back soon. How are you going to handle it? No problem, I'll just spend a few nights with Ted when I'm most fertile. It's a bit dull being with Scott every night anyway. And towards the end of my cycle, when it's safe, I'll want a couple of nights with Arnie. No way, Mal, it's not foolproof. You don't get Arnie again until you're pregnant. More laughter. It was still too early for my shock to morph into anger. I struggled not to accept the only logical conclusion from what I'd overheard, that Molly planned to conceive with Ted. I realized Ted and I bore a striking resemblance, despite his taller stature. We shared the same hair and eye color, and had similar body types, unlike Arnie, who was shorter and heavier. In the dimly lit living room, I remained frozen with horror on the chair, facing the abrupt end of my blissful marriage. I could hardly think, and then I noticed the conversation in the kitchen was wrapping up. Silently, I retreated to the bedroom, slipping back into bed and feigning sleep. Despite my shock, I knew confronting Molly immediately wasn't wise. Besides, who knew which sister would join me in bed next? So I regulated my breathing, and when one of them slipped under the covers a few minutes later, she assumed I was already asleep. I felt a gentle kiss on my cheek, and her soft voice whispered, "Love you, baby," just as Molly often did before we slept. It took all my willpower not to erupt and accuse her. "Oh, do you love me, you deceitful woman? Then how do you justify sleeping with my 2 brothers-in-law?" But I lay still, controlling my breaths, waiting for her to drift off. Planning. Within a few minutes, I could hear Molly's, or whoever's, breathing steady and calm. However, I waited a full hour, ensuring she was deeply asleep, before I slipped out of bed. I mulled over how they could have orchestrated it, realizing immediately it wouldn't have been difficult at all. If they were switching partners for intimacy alone, they would have swapped clothes during their evening gatherings. Given their shared part-time work at an interior design shop, none of them left their homes in the morning before Arnie, Ted, and I, reverting to their own attire in the morning would have been effortless. The only potential challenge might have been weekends. I figured we either spent weekends with our own wives, or they arranged to switch later in the day. But it would have still been feasible, considering we often had barbecues or brunches almost every weekend. And if not, a quick visit to my sister's house to pick up a catalog she has for me or some similar pretext would have sufficed. No, figuring out the how wasn't hard. It was the why that puzzled me. You might think we husbands should have noticed the difference. I mean, can't you distinguish your own wife from another woman, for heaven's sake? But here's the thing, we had no reason to be suspicious. We had no doubts, or at least I hadn't previously, about the woman in my bed. And there was something else I realized. Early in our marriage, Molly and I enjoyed lying in bed at night, talking. Before, after, or instead of sex. We discussed our relationship, future plans, work, family, everything. But that changed. I'm not sure exactly when, but several years ago, Molly started discouraging late-night conversations. She'd come to bed after her gatherings with her sisters, and we'd just sleep. We might have sex or not, but any attempts at conversation were met with, "I'm really tired, honey. Can we talk about it tomorrow?" In fact, For years, all our important conversations, all our sharing about our days or plans for the future, happened at dinner or earlier in the evening, never late at night in bed. It must have been a deliberate strategy. Less talking meant less chance of a wife being caught unaware or forgetting something due to the partner swapping. When I was certain Molly was asleep, I sneaked into the study, grabbed the ink pad for our checking account stamp, and got some indelible black ink on my fingertip. Returning to the bedroom, I gently made a small mark on her back, on the right side between her shoulder blade and shoulder. It was tiny, no bigger than a pencil eraser. She wouldn't notice unless carefully inspecting her back in the mirror. I washed my finger in the bathroom with soap and warm water. As expected, the ink stayed, even vigorous scrubbing only removed some. I worked on it with a pumice stone until it was faint enough to go unnoticed. Back in bed, I grimly smiled, contemplating my next step. The initial shock had subsided, replaced by deep anger. If what I understood from their conversation was true, Molly had betrayed me, thoroughly and systematically, perhaps for years. She and her sisters had prioritized themselves and their bond over the commitment to love and fidelity they owed their husbands. I felt manipulated, deceived, humiliated. I tried to envision a way to make things right, but saw none. On Saturday, we had a barbecue at Ted's house in the afternoon. I waited for a moment when the women were indoors, presumably preparing food. Ted was tending to the grill, so I asked Arnie if he wanted to take a quick walk around the block. He was always conscious of his weight, so he gladly accepted the chance for some exercise. When we were a safe distance from the house, I said, "Arnie, if you don't mind, I'd like to discuss something personal for a moment. Is that all right?" "Sure thing, Scott. What's on your mind?" "First, let's agree that this stays between us, all right? I don't want Molly or Hannah, or Amy and Ted, for that matter, to know about this conversation. So if anyone asks, let's just say we were talking about plans for next summer's trip, maybe Greece." Arnie seemed intrigued by the secrecy. He grinned and replied, "My lips are sealed. It's a bit awkward, but I wanted to ask about, well, your and Hannah's, sex life. Molly and I are intimate about once or twice a week, and I sometimes wish it could be more. I was just curious if her sisters were similar." Arnie gave me a friendly pat on the back and chuckled. "Sounds like you might be missing out there, buddy. Hannah and I usually do it every night, more or less. We might miss a night if she's on her period or one of us is really tired, but otherwise, it's pretty consistent." Seeing my reaction, he laughed. "Looks like you picked the wrong sister, huh?" "Well, how could you have known? None of us did. I guess I just lucked out." Keeping a disappointed expression to conceal my growing anger, I replied, "I suppose you did, Arnie. Can I ask, has it always been like that? From the start of your marriage?" He thought for a moment. "Pretty much. Hannah and I have this routine, you could say, a little game. You know how the girls have their gatherings in someone's kitchen most nights?" I nodded, and he continued, "I'm usually in bed, reading or watching TV by the time she gets back. And when she enters the bedroom, she gives me this look and always says the same thing, in a seductive voice, 'Well, big boy, how do you want me tonight?' And I suggest something, cowgirl, or maybe starting with a back rub or a blowjob, and then we go for it. Or occasionally, she'll come in and say, 'Hey, big boy, how about doggy style?' But almost always it's the same line, 'How do you want me tonight?' It might sound silly, but as long as I'm getting some action, I'm happy." He chuckled heartily, and I tried to join in. "One more question," I said. "Molly and I used to have deep conversations in bed about us, our relationship, that kind of thing. But lately, it's mostly just sex and sleep. We hardly talk anymore. Is Hannah the same?" "Pretty much. We reserve those meaningful relationship talks for other times of the day. It doesn't bother me much, to be honest. But it sounds like it's similar with you and Molly." He chuckled lightly, "the bedrooms for lovemaking, then drifting off to sleep." As we walked back to the house, Arnie chatted mostly about the Bengals, his other great passion aside from Hannah, and I tried to respond appropriately. But my mind was elsewhere. In a really cold, dark, desolate place. Growing angrier by the minute. I managed to keep my composure throughout the afternoon and evening, though I sensed that people noticed my withdrawn demeanor. Determined to hold it together for one more day, I took Molly out for her favorite Indian food after leaving Ted and Amy's, trying to be a cheerful companion all evening. Around 10, Molly spent her usual time with her sisters at Amy's, and upon her return, as we prepared for bed, I discreetly checked for the ink mark on her back. To my dismay, it wasn't there. That was the final straw, I thought. Whoever you are, it's time for you and your sisters to face the music. Honey, I began, how's that scratch on your leg? Let me take a look. She tensed slightly. The scratch? She asked cautiously. Yeah, the one from yesterday after dinner when you bumped into the dishwasher door, I replied, examining her legs. Oh, that, she responded a bit too casually. It's fine, didn't leave a mark. Right, I said, pretending to inspect closely. Can't see any trace of it. Great. It looked nasty yesterday. I chuckled to myself as I went to the bathroom to brush my teeth. There had never been a scratch, and her reaction confirmed that whoever was in my bedroom tonight wasn't the same as the night before. Back in bed a few minutes later, I greeted her, Hey, honey, let's end tonight like last night. It was fantastic. Confused, she asked, What do you mean? Don't you remember? I pressed, describing our previous night's intimacy in detail. Her shocked expression quickly turned to a pained one as she struggled to respond. Of course, honey, she finally said. I'm just not sure I'm up for something so energetic again tonight. Okay, I agreed, feigning understanding. We can take it slow. But say those things you said last night, all right? She embraced me tightly, avoiding eye contact. Of course, baby, she murmured. I'll say whatever you want, I just love turning you on. What were the things you liked? I grinned inwardly. Not letting her off the hook yet, I replied, Oh, you know, all of it. What you said during. As we continued, I noticed her lack of enthusiasm, despite my efforts to arouse her. Sensing something was off, I gently asked, Is everything all right, honey? You seem a bit distant tonight. Locking eyes with me, she apologized, Sorry, Scott. I'm just a bit tired, and my stomach's bothering me, must have been the spicy food. Let's make love, but I won't be wild tonight, okay? I smiled warmly, reassuring her, Of course, Molly. Let's keep it gentle tonight. We can save the passion for another time. She kissed me, visibly relieved, and I settled on top of her as she opened her legs. What ensued was a typical, pleasantly routine intimacy between married partners, much like I'd experienced countless times with my wife Molly, or so I thought. Sunday was the day everything would unravel. We had plans for brunch downtown at Trentino's, followed by a visit to Arnie and Hannah's. While keeping a close eye on Molly in the morning, I made sure she didn't contact her sisters beforehand. I could sense her frustration, likely thinking that her Friday counterpart had failed to brief her on the supposed scratch and wild night with me, neither of which occurred, of course. Once seated at Trentino's, Molly promptly signaled one of her sisters, Hannah, I need to freshen up. Mind joining me? They returned a few minutes later, both looking pale and tense. Despite their efforts to avoid me, their uneasy glances betrayed their discomfort. As expected, Molly must have accused Hannah of withholding information about our supposed escapades, which Hannah denied. Their anxiety was palpable, and even Amy picked up on the tension, though unaware of the specifics. Throughout the afternoon, their unease lingered, much to my satisfaction. While Ted, Arnie, and I enjoyed the football game, the sisters remained huddled together, barely participating in our gathering. Their distress persisted into the evening, evident in their subdued demeanor during dinner. Despite my efforts to maintain a cheerful demeanor, Molly struggled to engage, her fear apparent. Throughout the evening, as we tidied up the kitchen and watched TV, I maintained a facade of normalcy, all the while observing Molly with apprehension in her eyes. Around 9:15, she said, Honey, I'm going to pop over to Hannah's for a bit, okay? Sure thing, babe. While you're out, I might start packing up my stuff and loading it into my car. The larger furniture will require a truck, so I'll handle that later in the week. Her complexion drained of color. Scott, what What do you mean? Why are you packing? In a nonchalant tone, I replied, because I'm leaving. I can't stay in a house with a deceitful, unfaithful woman, can I? She gasped, her eyes fixed on me. But honey, I don't understand. I simply watched her, letting her words falter. Deep down, she knew exactly what I meant, but couldn't bring herself to say it. See you when you're back, I said, turning towards the stairs. No, Scott, please wait, she pleaded, her voice trembling. Ignoring her, I proceeded to pack. I knew her next move would be to call her sisters, and I was right. Within minutes, Molly appeared at the bedroom door, accompanied by Amy and Hannah. Honey, could you come down and talk with us? She looked distraught, tears streaking her cheeks and makeup smudged. For a fleeting moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Sure, I replied, walking past her towards the den. I grabbed my digital voice recorder, set it to record, and slipped it into my pocket. In the kitchen, the three women sat anxiously at the table. I took a seat and surveyed them expectantly. So? I prompted. A heavy silence hung in the air. None of them dared to speak. Finally, Molly choked out, Scott, you know how much I love you, right? Forgive me, I replied coolly, but which sister are you again? I'm Molly, she sobbed, your wife. Is that so? Hold on a moment, please. I checked their backs, one had the black mark. They watched me, bewildered. Sitting down again, I addressed them, all right, let's assume you're Molly. Then where were you on Friday night when your sister here, gesturing to the marked one, was in bed with me? They stared at me, speechless. Take your time, I urged. I'm not in a rush. I'm sure there's a perfectly logical explanation for why at least two, if not all three of you, spent the night in my bed over the past 3 nights. A prolonged silence ensued. Molly began to cry, while the others remained grim-faced. I have packing to attend to, I declared, making to leave. No, please wait. Molly implored. I'll explain, I promise. Just give me a chance to make you understand. Despite my anger, I found myself curious to hear their justification, what convoluted reasoning the three of them could offer for their actions. And, most importantly, whether they would tell me the truth. I waited patiently, but Molly was too overwhelmed with tears to speak. Her sister, Hannah, stepped in to explain. It was just a foolish game, Scott. It started as harmless banter and somehow escalated. And you are? I prompted. Hannah. Listen, it began about a month ago as playful teasing among us. We joked about our spouses, discussing what we liked and disliked, and it eventually turned to the topic of intimacy. And somehow we got the idea of trying each of you out. You know, switching. I guess it must sound absurd now, but it began as lighthearted challenges, like you're too timid to do it, and then, well, after a while, it became more serious. Molly and Amy fixed their gazes on Hannah as she continued. Anyway, Friday night was the culmination. We swapped clothes when we met here in the kitchen and went to each other's homes. Amy was with you, I was with Ted, and Molly was with Arnie. Then, on Saturday, we reverted at the barbecue. It was foolish, Scott, we all see that now. And you must be rightfully upset, but please give Molly the chance to make amends. She adores you. Just look at how devastated she is. Hannah gestured towards her weeping sister. So, I interjected, Amy was with me, while Molly was with Arnie? They nodded in unison. I turned to Amy. So, Amy, how was it? How did our encounter compare to being with Ted? Amy appeared bewildered. I don't know, Scott. It was good, actually. Good? Really? Could you remind me what exactly happened? Amy hesitated, avoiding my gaze. I can't recall, it was 2 nights ago, the first instance of swapping spouses with your sister, and you can't recall what occurred? Do you have memory issues now? I redirected my attention to Hannah. A valiant attempt, Hannah, but your narrative is unfounded. Yes, Amy was in my bed on Friday night, as I marked her back with black ink after she fell asleep, and it's still visible, but we didn't engage in intercourse at all. And don't insult my intelligence further by fabricating that this was the inaugural event. Do you think I'm unaware that the three of you prefer Arnie as the best partner? They gasped, but I pressed on. And do you think I'm oblivious to the fact that he's indulged nightly by one of you three, while I receive far less? My consolation prize seems to be servicing you whenever you desire. I paused, observing their reactions. Molly was nearly hysterical, while her sisters remained somber. My patience waned, but I yearned for them to confess. You have one final opportunity, I declared. One chance to speak the truth. This time, I want to hear it from Molly. How long have you been intimate with each other's spouses? She met my gaze, beseeching, before averting her eyes to the table. 4 years. Since shortly after Hannah and Arnie's wedding. Silence enveloped the room. I waited for more. Hannah spoke up first. It wasn't her decision, Scott. Amy and I pushed for it. But it wasn't frequent, Scott. Molly protested. Just occasionally, like a couple of times per year. All right, I said, pressing further, and then? Silence met my inquiry. So it became more regular over time? I prompted. Reluctantly, Amy responded, yes. So, the three of you have been regularly sharing the three husbands, like a rotation? I directed my question to Molly, who nodded, visibly distressed. And when did it escalate to Arnie enjoying nightly encounters and me receiving occasional intimacy out of pity? She refused to meet my gaze or respond. How many nights a week were you with Arnie, Molly? 1 or 2, she murmured. Fantastic, I retorted, reaching my limit. I've heard enough, and there's no justification to hear more. It was just physical, honey, Molly pleaded, locking eyes with me. It meant nothing in terms of love, nothing compared to our bond. Is that so? And it had nothing to do with potentially conceiving a child with Ted, as you doubted my ability? She gasped, her sisters alarmed. Scott, what are you? You think I'm unaware, my devoted wife, that your intention was to get pregnant by Ted, considering you doubted my fertility? No, Scott, she exclaimed, rushing to embrace me. I shoved her away, causing her to stumble into the refrigerator. Don't you dare touch me. You betrayed me in every conceivable manner with the help of your sisters. Now, you can share Arnie and Ted among yourselves, unless you decide to add another man to your roster when you crave oral sex. Before they could respond, I stormed out through the door, ignoring the cries emanating from the kitchen. I exited the front door with my suitcase, without another glance back, though the sounds of weeping followed. I endured a night filled with rage and sleeplessness at the Hyatt, and the next morning, I took a leave from work to consult my lawyer and visit the bank. I arranged a lunch meeting with Arnie and Ted, emphasizing its urgency to prompt Ted to cancel his prior engagement. Seated in a diner booth, we ordered sandwiches before I divulged the bombshell. Guys, I don't know if you'll believe this, but our wives have been unfaithful to us. Specifically, they've been swapping beds among the three of us for years. Arnie was utterly stunned, while Ted displayed a hint of acceptance. I suspected something of the sort, Ted confessed. I didn't want to believe it, but... Both Arnie and I were taken aback. What made you suspect? I inquired. There were numerous instances where Amy forgot things, conversations from earlier in the day or the night prior. I wasn't certain, naturally, and I refrained from making accusations without concrete evidence. I've been jotting down some notes on the things she's forgotten. I figured once I had something more conclusive, I'd discuss it with you guys. Anyway, how did you figure it out? Ted inquired. I recounted the conversation I overheard and then explained the trick with the ink mark. Ted appeared pensive, while Arnie repeated, unbelievable, absolutely unbelievable. After I finished, Arnie asked, are you absolutely sure, Scott? I mean, this is just so crazy. I have a recording of the conversation I had with them last night, I replied, playing the tape without further ado. Once it ended, we exchanged grim looks before delving into serious discussion. Arnie and Ted both informed their offices that they wouldn't be in that afternoon. I stated my intention to divorce Molly. There was no turning back. However, they were still uncertain about their next steps. We conversed for a couple of hours, and ironically, I felt closer to my two brothers-in-law than ever before. They were truly great guys, and I would miss them dearly. I found an apartment that suited me, returned with a truck to retrieve a few pieces of furniture, and settled in. By the end of the week, I had moved all my clothes and belongings out of the house. Molly had been incessantly calling me at work and on my cell. I instructed the office assistant to block her calls and obtained a new cell number. Keeping my apartment phone number unlisted turned out to be a wise decision as well. I initiated divorce proceedings and prepared to move forward with my life. On Thursday, I had a peculiar conversation with Barbara, a friend from work. I suppose everyone in the office could sense my distraction and anger, prompting her to inquire about it. I divulged the entire story to her, and her expression shifted from surprise to sympathy, tinged with a hint of satisfaction. That angered me, and I didn't hesitate to voice my discontent. "I'm sorry, Scott," she exclaimed. "I'm certainly not pleased about what they did to you." "It's just that." She seemed slightly embarrassed. "It's just that, well, I always thought that you and I might, make a good couple." I stared at her. Barbara wasn't just kind and fun, she was also tall and remarkably attractive. While I had always recognized her beauty, I had been so deeply in love with Molly that I hadn't seriously considered it. Now, suddenly, it seemed worth contemplating. We conversed further, leaving the topic open-ended, but Barbara could sense that I was viewing her in a different light. Through my lawyer, Molly pleaded to see me, hoping for an opportunity to clarify matters. I was convinced that there wasn't anything she could say to alter my stance, but I agreed to meet her nonetheless. And as expected, I was proven right. We were seated in my attorney's conference room about 6 weeks after I had moved out. As Molly entered, she looked somber yet strikingly beautiful. I gestured for her to take a seat. "So, Molly," I began, "how have you been? Has Ted gotten you pregnant yet?" Her cheeks flushed. "No, Scott, I haven't been intimate with Ted or anyone else. And I wouldn't want to conceive with anyone but you. You know," I continued, "the night I overheard you in the kitchen, I was about to tell you that Dr. Randall confirmed my sperm count was fine. It was a bit low, but still sufficient for conception. There was no need to rely on Ted. On the other hand," I added, "you were having relations with him and Arnie regularly, so I suppose it wouldn't have mattered either way." Molly's eyes were already welling up with tears. "Please, Scott, let me explain. Let me express how truly sorry I am, how much remorse I feel." "Do you believe you feel worse than I do, Molly?" I asked, meeting her gaze with a solemn expression. She shook her head sadly. "Fine," I relented with a sigh. "Go ahead. But spare me the declarations of love. Spare me the claims that your actions had nothing to do with us. Just spare me, okay?" "But Scott, it truly wasn't about us," Molly protested. "It was. I don't know, just a reckless thing that Hannah, Amy, and I did. Something we've always done, ever since high school. Our little game, never meant to cause harm." "Did you play this game with all your previous boyfriends?" I inquired. "Pretty much, with anyone we dated for an extended period," she admitted. "We've always been incredibly close, and this, well, I suppose it brought us even closer. We shared everything, clothes, gossip, friends, even boyfriends." I listened silently, absorbing her words. I was gaining insight, albeit reluctantly. "When we got married, I assumed it would stop, and it did, for several years," Molly continued. "Wait a moment," I interjected. "Were your sisters intimate with me while you and I were dating?" Molly blushed. "Yes, a couple of times. I wasn't keen on the idea, especially as our relationship grew serious, but they insisted." "Well," I remarked sarcastically, "I must have passed the test, considering you didn't break up with me." She remained silent. "Molly, do you understand the gravity of your actions?" I pressed on. "You deceived me so you and your sisters could have your fun. You chose Arnie over me for years because he satisfied you more in bed. Have you even begun to grasp how that makes me feel? What exactly makes him so superior? No, wait, don't answer that. I don't want to hear it. Her lip quivered. Scott, I know it was terrible. But, you got to be intimate with all three of us. But I didn't know it. I retorted. Haven't you realized that yet? Even if we had discussed swapping partners, which I would never have agreed to, but let's set that aside, even if we had, I would have experienced the thrill and novelty of being with other women. But I didn't realize they weren't you, Molly. To me, it was always you. Not someone new and thrilling. Just the woman I cherished more than anything. I grew increasingly frustrated. How could she fail to comprehend the magnitude of her actions and those of her sisters? Listen, I said firmly, it's straightforward. I was your husband. You were supposed to prioritize me over anyone else. Our relationship should have taken precedence over all others. And it didn't. You prioritized Hannah and Amy over me. You chose to be with Arnie instead of me. You were willing to let Ted impregnate you without even discussing it with me, for goodness sake. And now, you can have them. But you won't have me. I had reached my limit. Standing up, I made my way towards the door. Amidst her sobs, she pleaded, but darling, I don't want them. I want you. Well, I replied, isn't that touching? After all this time, you finally decided to pick me over your sisters. But now, the choice isn't yours, it's mine. And I choose to be free from the woman who has deceived and betrayed me, who has made a mockery of our relationship for years. Have a good life. She whipped into her hands, but made no effort to stop me as I exited the room. After that conversation, moving on suddenly felt more feasible. Barbara and I began dating, and by the third date, I realized there were other women in the world besides Molly, or her sisters, with whom I could find pleasure. Barbara was vibrant and grateful, and our first night together extended into an entire weekend. It was passionate and enjoyable, and whether it would evolve into something serious remained uncertain. Nevertheless, it significantly boosted my self-esteem. We're still seeing each other, being intimate frequently, but taking things slow. Barbara understands the complexities of my situation and doesn't pressure me, which I value. Arnie opted not to kick Hannah out, not entirely unexpected, I suppose. He was the preferred choice of the sisters in bed, after all, and the revelations about their activities weren't as devastating to him as they were to Ted and me. However, he did insist that Hannah grow her hair long, ensuring she couldn't swap places with her sisters without his knowledge. He warned her that if she ever cheated on him again, with me, Ted, or anyone else, she'd be out on the streets with nothing. And while he mentioned he wouldn't mind continuing relations with Amy or Molly occasionally, it would be on his terms, not theirs. Arnie mentioned Hannah appeared quite annoyed at that, but she kept quiet. She knows she's treading on thin ice, he told me with a smirk. Ted found a way to inflict the most anguish on Amy, though it wasn't intentional. He secured a promising job in Chicago and informed Amy he was relocating there in 3 weeks. You can join me there, and we'll seek counseling to mend our marriage, he proposed to her. Or you can remain in Cincinnati with your sisters. The choice is yours. Now Amy is torn. She can't let go of Ted, yet she can't imagine being apart from her sisters either. Tough luck, if you ask me. Forget her, all three of them.